Picture the image everyone carries in their head. Tall white felt caps swaying in unison. Muskets raised at the walls of Vienna. A wall of green banners advancing behind the sound of a military band, the first in Europe to march men into battle to the beat of drums and cymbals. Terrified enemy soldiers who had never heard synchronized war music before, breaking formation before a single shot was fired. This is the version of the Janissary Corps that survives in paintings and battle narratives. The unstoppable slave soldiers of the Sultan, loyal unto death, the sharp edge of an empire that stretched from Budapest to Baghdad. It is almost entirely the wrong version. Strip away the muskets and the marching band, and the Janissary Corps was, above everything else, a 600-year experiment in employment economics that Ottoman sultans could never fully control. Less like an unstoppable war machine in the popular imagination, more like a labor union with muskets, a payroll system, a pension scheme, a real estate empire, and eventually a jobs program so entrenched that reforming it meant risking your own throne and abolishing it meant burning down a piece of your own capital city. The Ottomans did not build the most feared standing army in Europe primarily through fanatical loyalty. They built it through an extraordinarily clever compensation structure, and then spent 200 years watching that same structure quietly turn against them. To understand how, you have to build the core from nothing and follow the money. Generation by generation, all the way to the morning gunners turned their cannons on their own barracks, buying soldiers before they could walk. Start with the strangest line item in the entire system. Recruitment itself, because the Ottomans didn't recruit the Janissary Corps. They harvested it. Beginning in the 14th century, the empire operated a periodic levy on its Christian subjects, mostly in the Balkans, known as the Devshirme, literally a collecting. Ottoman officials moved through Christian villages in Bulgaria, Serbia, Albania, Bosnia, and Greece, and selected boys, typically somewhere between 8 and 18 years old, physically strong, and by design taken from rural families rather than cities, where the Ottomans judged urban children too soft and already too politically connected to protect. The tradition began under an early sultan who used his customary 1/5 share of captives taken in the Balkans to form a new corps he called the New Soldier, Janissary in Turkish, which Europeans eventually transliterated as Janissary. This was, from the very first ledger entry, a system designed to solve a specific financial and political problem. A feudal lord's soldiers were loyal to the lord who fed them. A hired mercenary was loyal to whoever paid the largest sum that week. The Ottomans wanted a third option entirely, soldiers with no family, no local loyalty, no land, and no possible claim to power except through the Sultan himself. These boys were legally the Sultan's slaves, known as servants of the door, kapakulara, and being the Sultan's property was, paradoxically, the single most prestigious and lucrative position a poor rural family's son could ever hold. The economics of this recruitment pipeline were unlike anything else in the early modern world. Rome and later European states paid cash to attract volunteers. The Ottomans paid nothing up front for their soldiers. They simply took them, converted them to Islam, and then invested years of state resources turning them into either elite infantry or, for the sharpest boys, palace administrators, who would go on to run the empire's bureaucracy. The Devshirme was, in the coldest possible accounting terms, a zero-cost acquisition of human capital, paid for entirely by the conquered populations the empire had already absorbed. The state's actual expenditure began only after the boy had already been selected, converted, and assigned, at which point the training budget, not the recruitment budget, took over. Selected boys were sent first to Turkish farming families in Anatolia to learn the language, physical labor, and Islamic customs. A multi-year apprenticeship the state paid almost nothing for, beyond a small provincial stipend, because the host families absorbed the boy's food and lodging in exchange for his labor. Only afterward did the most promising recruits move to training barracks in Istanbul, where the state finally began paying real money, room, board, military instruction, and for a select few, the kind of literary, administrative, and linguistic education that could eventually land a Devshirme-raised farm boy in the Sultan's own inner council. The levy itself was applied unevenly, and the exceptions carved into it reveal just how calculated the whole operation was. Villages that had surrendered to Ottoman forces peacefully, rather than through conquest, sometimes negotiated explicit exemptions from the Devshirme as part of their terms of surrender, and the levy was never applied inside Istanbul itself, where the state judged urban families too integrated into commerce, craft guilds, and city administration to safely strip of their sons without provoking unrest close to the seat of power. Greek children in particular were taken less often than their Balkan neighbors, precisely because Greek communities tended to cluster in cities and coastal trading towns rather than the isolated rural villages the levy targeted. The Devshirme, in other words, was not indiscriminate cruelty. It was a resource extraction system carefully calibrated to take from populations with the least capacity to resist and the least political cost attached to their loss. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the single strangest fact in the entire system. The Ottoman Empire's military and administrative elite, grand viziers, provincial governors, admirals, were disproportionately drawn from Christian peasant boys taken by force from their families and raised as the personal property of the Sultan. It was simultaneously one of history's most brutal recruitment systems and one of its most effective social mobility engines, and both of those things were true for the same underlying reason. The state had a direct financial interest in maximizing the value of an asset it had acquired for free. The paycheck that became a political weapon. Once trained, a Janissary received something almost no other soldier in the world at the time could count on, a guaranteed regular cash salary called the uluf, paid out quarterly in coin rather than the seasonal campaign-only pay common across contemporary European armies. This regularity was itself the innovation. The Janissary Corps was distinctive for the regular payment of a cash salary to the troops, differing sharply from the standard practice of paying soldiers only during active campaigns. A knight in France or Burgundy served a fixed number of days a year in exchange for land rights and went home when the fighting stopped. A Janissary served year-round, drilled through the winter, and drew pay through the winter too, which meant the Ottoman state was the first in Europe since Rome itself to shoulder the burden of a genuinely standing, professionally salaried army. This was one of the primary reasons the empire expanded as rapidly as it did across the Balkans and the Mediterranean, a permanent, disciplined, full-time fighting force competing against European kings, still relying on knights who owed only a fixed number of service days a year. And the ceremony around payday was deliberately theatrical, because the sultans understood something modern compensation consultants would recognize instantly. Visible, personal generosity from the boss buys loyalty far more effectively than money that simply appears in an account. The sultan himself, after authorizing the payment, would sometimes dress as a janissary, visit the barracks, and receive his own salary in the pay line alongside his men, reinforcing the fiction that he was simply the first and most senior soldier in his own army. A piece of theater that cemented the Corps' identity as elite household troops bound directly to the ruler's person. But regular salary, as Rome's emperors had already discovered centuries earlier on a different continent, was never enough on its own. Ottoman sultans layered an entire second compensation system on top of the ulufe. And this second system is where the real financial danger lived. The bonus that ate the treasury. Every time a new sultan took the throne, tradition demanded he pay every member of the kapakulu, janissaries, artillery, armorers, and cavalry, a lavish one-time accession bonus known as the kulis bashishi, along with a permanent increase to their base salary going forward. The practice is traditionally traced to an early sultan who distributed the first such bonus to his household troops upon becoming ruler after the Battle of Kosovo, a gesture every one of his successors felt obligated to repeat. Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror later formalized the kulis bashishi into actual law, cementing it as a permanent, non-negotiable obligation rather than a discretionary gift. Read that structure carefully because it created a genuinely dangerous incentive loop. A new sultan's accession was, from the Corps' perspective, a payday event. The bonus came in two forms, a one-time lump sum and a permanent raise folded directly into the quarterly uluf going forward, meaning every succession didn't just cost the treasury once, it raised the empire's baseline payroll obligation forever after, which meant the Janissaries had a standing financial motive to want sultans to change more often, not less. Many padishahs actually attempted to abolish or reduce the kulis bakshishi outright, specifically because the Janissaries had begun fomenting unrest and deposing sultans as a means of forcing fresh accessions, and with them, fresh bonuses. The Corps that was supposed to protect the throne had discovered it could profit handsomely from destabilizing it. The 17th century turned this discovery into open practice. In one 5-year stretch, the Ottoman throne changed hands 4 separate times. One sultan deposed for madness, his replacement toppled in a Janissary revolt, and the first man reinstated, then deposed a second time in favor of yet another successor, meaning the treasury paid out a full round of accession bonuses and permanent salary increases 4 times in 5 years. Even the Sultan, who finally restored stability, had explicitly promised on his accession that he would not demand a bonus or a raise, and found the Janissaries reneging on that promise anyway, forcing the palace to melt down its own gold and silver plate to strike coin and pay them off. The danger of stiffing them was made brutally literal at one earlier accession, where the incoming Sultan was physically intercepted and blocked from entering Istanbul by his own household troops until the payment and promised promotions were formally guaranteed, the Kapakulu assaulting the state dignitaries sent to negotiate on the Sultan's behalf. By the 18th century, the fiscal danger of this loop had become obvious enough that reformers moved to shut it down entirely. The Kulis Bashishi was finally abolished under Sultan Abdulhamid I. Specifically because the Janissaries' indifferent conduct and repeated breaches of military discipline in pursuit of the bonus had become intolerable, and the same reform effort included a formal count of the corps and a ban on the buying and selling of soldier pay slips, a corrupt secondary market that had by then metastasized into one of the biggest financial scandals in the empire. That payslip market deserves its own explanation, because it is the clearest evidence of just how far the compensation system had drifted from its original purpose. The salary that became a financial instrument. By the late 16th century, something had fundamentally changed inside the corps, and it started with a decision that seemed harmless at the time. Sultans began permitting Janissaries to marry and to enroll their own sons directly into the corps, bypassing the Devshirme entirely. This single shift undermined the founding principle of the entire system: loyal, foreign-born slave soldiers with no family ties and no local power base to protect. And from that point forward, recruitment standards fell and training diminished, as many new Janissaries were no longer Balkan conscripts at all, but Turkish-born civilians who simply paid for admission into the corps, drawn by the prestige, the salary, and the tax exemptions that came with the uniform. Once membership could effectively be purchased, the salary itself, the assam, a formal pay ticket entitling its holder to a quarterly stipend, turned into something closer to a tradable financial security than a wage. Wealthy Istanbul merchants, artisans, and even people with no intention of ever picking up a musket bought assam tickets purely as an investment, collecting the guaranteed state salary and the accompanying tax exemptions while never spending a single day in a barracks or on a campaign. The corps that had begun as an elite fighting force acquired at zero cost through forced conscription had become, 2 centuries later, a state-backed annuity product that anyone with enough money could buy into. The consequences show up starkly in the surviving numbers. By 1790, some 12,000 Janissaries were said to reside in Istanbul, of whom only around 2,000 were combat capable, and when the corps was formally summoned for campaign in 1810, only 13,000 actually assembled out of estimates that placed total nominal strength anywhere between 150,000 and 400,000 men, of whom only around 50,000 ever served as actual soldiers, the rest simply collecting pay while refusing to fight. Read that gap again. An army whose payroll obligated the Treasury to as many as 400,000 salaries, when the number of men who would show up for a battle was closer to 50,000. Every assam ticket held by a merchant who had never trained a day in his life was a permanent, compounding drain on the imperial treasury, indistinguishable on the books from the salary of a genuine frontline soldier, and functionally impossible to claw back because doing so meant confronting a politically connected civilian investor class that had every financial incentive to defend the status quo. And the corps kept growing throughout all of this, numbering only about 10,000 men by the mid-16th century, occupied almost entirely with training in their Istanbul barracks. But that number swelled 4 to 6 times over as the empire scrambled to keep pace with the rise of professional, firearm-equipped European armies. Salaries stayed generous, even as the ranks filled with men who had never fought, and public expenditure climbed in lockstep. The Ottoman treasury's answer to the resulting fiscal strain was the same one Rome had reached for centuries earlier, facing an identical problem: debasing the currency, which kept the nominal value of Janissary salaries technically intact while quietly gutting the actual purchasing power of every ordinary Ottoman citizen outside the corps. Land instead of cash, the system. Next door. It's worth pausing here to note that the Janissaries were never the only soldiers on the Ottoman payroll, and the contrast with their counterparts explains a great deal about why the corps became so financially and politically dangerous in the first place. Ottoman provincial cavalry, the Sipahis, were paid through an entirely different mechanism called the Timar system. Rather than drawing a cash salary from the treasury, a Sipahi was granted the projected tax revenue of a specific parcel of conquered land, collecting that revenue directly from local peasants in exchange for showing up, fully equipped, whenever the Sultan called a campaign. This was, in effect, compensation that paid for itself. No treasury cash ever changed hands. The soldier had a direct personal stake in the productivity of his own assigned territory, and the empire's core military obligation scaled automatically with however much new land it conquered. The Ottomans had actually arrived at the Timar system out of the exact same budget pressure the Janissaries would later create. Early salaried infantry forces had grown so numerous that their wages became too burdensome for the treasury to sustain, so newly conquered lands were assigned to their commanders as Timars instead of continued cash pay. The Janissaries broke this elegant self-funding logic completely. As a slave soldier corps loyal directly to the Sultan's household rather than the land, they had to be paid in hard cash from the central treasury. Full stop, with no revenue-generating estate attached to offset the cost. Every single Janissary salary was a pure, unhedged liability sitting on the empire's central books, which is exactly why the size of the corps mattered so much, and why letting that size balloon past any operational need turned into one of the most expensive unforced errors in Ottoman fiscal history. Equipping and housing an army that never went home. Because Janissaries served year-round rather than seasonally, the state carried costs no feudal system ever had to absorb. Permanent barracks in Istanbul and provincial garrison towns, standing armories, and a logistics tail that had to function in peacetime just as reliably as during a siege. The corps functioned as a genuinely sophisticated military machine even by later standards. Siege specialists, elite riflemen, engineers, and sappers, accompanied on campaign by dedicated supply corps, mobile hospitals, and armorers, arguably the most advanced military logistics apparatus anywhere in the early modern world. They were also among the earliest infantry forces anywhere to adopt firearms at scale, fielding muskets by the 15th and 16th centuries, and playing the decisive role in victories from the 1453 conquest of Constantinople through generations of warfare against the Habsburgs. A Janissary regiment functioned, in practical terms, as its soldiers' entire family structure. They lived together in barracks and, during peacetime, doubled as the empire's police and firefighting corps in Istanbul, a dual-use arrangement that let the state extract ordinary civil service labor out of men. It was already paying a full military salary. That's a detail worth sitting with, because it's a genuinely clever piece of cost accounting. Rather than fund a separate police force and a separate fire brigade, the empire simply assigned those functions to soldiers already on the books, getting 2 additional labor categories out of a single salary line. Originally, Janissaries could not marry and could not take up any trade outside the military until retirement. But by the mid-18th century, that restriction had collapsed entirely, and very few of them continued to actually live in the barracks at all, instead scattering into the city to pursue trades, run shops, and manage the estates accumulated through generations of tax-exempt salary income. A corps originally designed to have zero ties to civilian economic life had, by the 18th century, become deeply and permanently embedded in it. Shopkeepers and guild members and property owners who happened to also collect a state military salary and carry the legal privileges that came with it. The kitchen that doubled as a union hall. There is one more piece of Janissary organizational design worth understanding because it turned an ordinary logistics function, feeding soldiers, into the single most effective collective bargaining mechanism any pre-modern army ever built. Each Janissary regiment, called an orta, was organized entirely around the language and imagery of a kitchen. The whole corps was known as the okak, the hearth, and its most senior commanders carried titles like chorbachu, meaning soup maker, assisted by officers titled head cook, head water carrier, and scullion. Every orta marched and camped behind its own great copper cauldron, or kazan, an object treated with something close to religious reverence, a physical stand-in for the Sultan's own promise to feed and provide for his household troops. Accepting food from that cauldron was, symbolically and literally, an act of accepting the Sultan's authority, which meant refusing that food carried an unmistakable meaning too. When a regiment was aggrieved over unpaid wages, a broken promotion promise, a resented decision from the palace, the Janissaries had a specific ritualized act of protest available to them: overturning the cauldron. The clatter of ladles against an upturned kazan in the old hippodrome was, by tradition, the loudest and most frightening sound a sitting sultan could hear, because it meant his household troops had just publicly rejected his food, and by extension his rule. The Turkish phrase for causing an uprising, kazan kaldırmak, literally raising the cauldron, survives in the language today as shorthand for exactly that kind of organized upheaval. This was not an occasional or symbolic gesture confined to folklore. It was a functioning, repeatedly used political mechanism with a real body count attached to it. The overturned cauldron preceded the 1622 deposition and execution of Sultan Osman II, a ruler who had alarmed the corps by planning to replace them with a new army recruited from Anatolia and the provinces, precisely the kind of institutional threat that, 2 centuries later, would finally cost the Janissaries their own existence at the hands of Mahmud II. Notice what this mechanism actually was, stripped of its ceremonial dressing. A built-in strike apparatus, embedded directly into the Corps' own organizational chart, requiring no external union structure and no formal negotiation process. Because the kitchen hierarchy that fed thousands of soldiers every single day was, simultaneously, the exact same hierarchy that could organize and legitimize a mutiny within hours. Rome's legions along the Rhine took days to coordinate a revolt in 14 AD, spreading grievance camp to camp through word of mouth. The Janissaries could communicate the same message across their entire garrison in Istanbul in the time it took to flip a pot. The retirement the state couldn't afford to skip. Retired or discharged Janissaries received pensions, and their children were looked after by the state as well, a promise that, layered on top of everything else, meant the Treasury's Janissary-related obligations didn't end when a soldier's fighting days did. This created the same structural trap Rome had encountered with its own veteran legionaries centuries earlier. A large, aging population of men who had spent their entire adult lives inside a single system, expected pensions on schedule, and possessed both the military training and the collective identity to make an extremely dangerous political faction if that expectation was ever broken. Unlike Rome, which eventually solved the problem by extending years of required service to defer the bill, the Ottomans faced a version of the problem that never actually stopped growing. Because the Corps' total membership itself was expanding largely unchecked through hereditary enrollment, and the ASAM trade, meaning the pension and support obligation for retired and disabled Janissaries, kept compounding right alongside the active payroll, with no equivalent of a fixed legion count to put a ceiling on the liability. The tax exemption that broke the marketplace. The financial damage the Corps did to the empire was never confined to the Treasury's own ledgers. It leaked out into the wider Ottoman economy in a way that most accounts of Janissary history skip entirely. A Janissary salary came bundled with a set of tax exemptions, originally justified as compensation for a soldier's willingness to die on campaign. Once the Corps opened its ranks to Turkish civilians who bought their way in through the ASAM trade, and once serving Janissaries won the right to hold second jobs and run their own businesses in Istanbul, those same tax exemptions traveled with them into the marketplace. A Janissary who opened a bakery, ran a butcher's stall, or set up as a tanner was competing directly against ordinary guild members who owed the full slate of state and municipal taxes, while the Janissary, protected by his military status, owed considerably less, or in some cases nothing at all. This is a distortion any modern economist would recognize instantly. It wasn't that Janissary-owned businesses were more efficient or more skilled. They were structurally subsidized, able to undercut legitimate guild competitors on price while carrying a fraction of their tax burden, which meant ordinary Istanbul artisans and merchants found themselves competing against a rival who effectively had the imperial treasury absorbing part of his overhead. Guilds that had operated under consistent rules for centuries were suddenly forced to either match impossible prices or watch trade migrate toward core-affiliated shops that could not lose money the same way an ordinary business could. The state, meanwhile, lost twice over. It lost the tax revenue those businesses should have generated, and it lost the broader economic health of a guild sector being slowly hollowed out by unfair internal competition, all while continuing to pay the full military salary of men who were, in practice, spending their days behind a shop counter rather than drilling with a musket. The same exemptions that had once been a reasonable price for genuine battlefield risk had, by the 18th century, become an unearned and largely permanent competitive advantage handed to a shrinking pool of men who increasingly did no fighting at all. When the Corps started deciding who wore the crown, by the 17th century, the financial leverage built into the Janissary compensation system had curdled into something closer to open political blackmail, and the empire's own sultans became the primary casualties. In 1807, the Janissaries overthrew and later killed Sultan Selim III after he attempted military reforms that threatened their privileges and pay. Despite their declining combat value, the Corps retained an immense esprit de corps and a fierce institutional will to survive, showing that whatever real military edge had eroded, their capacity for organized political resistance had not. This is the mirror image of what happened along the Rhine and Danube after Augustus's death, and it points to the same underlying lesson dressed in different clothes. A standing army paid in cash with no land holding to root its loyalty to any particular outcome beyond its own salary will eventually treat the ruler's survival as negotiable the moment the ruler's fiscal or political choices threaten its compensation. Rome's legions mutinied over unpaid wages and broken service terms. The Janissaries went considerably further, treating the identity of the Sultan himself as a lever to be pulled whenever pay, privileges, or promotions felt insufficient. The Sultan, who finally called the bluff. By 1825, Sultan Mahmud II had become committed to eliminating the Janissaries entirely, but rather than confronting them directly and risking exactly the fate that had befallen Selim III, he spent years quietly building alliances with the religious establishment and other branches of the military, securing the support of the Grand Mufti, while steadily strengthening a loyal corps of 12,000 modern artillery troops under his own direct control. The final trigger arrived after the Janissaries performed badly during the Greek War of Independence, forcing the empire to lean on Egyptian military assistance to suppress the revolt. A humiliation Mahmud used to justify a formal decree in May 1826, announcing that the Janissaries would be redistributed throughout the wider military rather than kept concentrated in their own separate units. The Janissaries, predictably, refused to accept the dissolution of an institution central to their entire identity and mutinied, advancing on the Sultan's own guard. On June 14, 1826, they assembled in the Hippodrome demanding an audience to air their grievances, and Mahmud II responded by ordering his artillery to open fire directly on the assembled corps, driving the survivors back into their own barracks. Mahmud then brought out the sacred standard of the Prophet from the Treasury, calling every true believer in Istanbul to gather beneath it against the Janissaries. And in the fighting that followed, artillery set the Janissary barracks ablaze, killing roughly 4,000 men outright, with hundreds more dying in the street fighting across the capital. Of the roughly 135,000 Janissaries nominally on the books at the time, most rose against Mahmud II, and once the rebellion was crushed, 6,000 or more were executed outright, with thousands of additional survivors exiled or imprisoned. The remainder of the captured force was put to death by decapitation at a fortress in Thessaloniki that, from that point forward, became known locally as the Blood Tower. The following morning, Mahmud II issued an imperial decree formally declaring the corps abolished, branding its members traitors to both the state and the faith, and going further still, prohibiting any future reference to the Janissaries by name at all, ordering the destruction of their regimental cauldrons, the physical symbol of unit loyalty passed down for centuries, and mandating that their barracks across the empire be demolished or repurposed entirely. Mahmud also moved immediately against the Bektashi religious order, the corps' long-standing spiritual affiliate, closing more than 200 of its lodges and seizing endowments that had supported thousands of adherents, redirecting those confiscated resources straight into funding the new modern army meant to finally replace the one he had just destroyed. Within weeks, on July 7, 1826, Mahmud II formally established a new standing army, the trained victorious soldiers of Muhammad. Deliberately built along modern European organizational lines, the first serious attempt in Ottoman history to replace a household slave soldier corps with something resembling a genuinely modern conscript military. Under the new system, salaries were paid across a full 12 years of required service, a dramatic escalation from the far shorter terms that had briefly existed just before the corps' destruction, reflecting how badly the Treasury needed a workforce it could plan and budget around for the long term, rather than one that could hold the throne hostage every time a payday came due. The machine that turned on its builders. Rome's legions were, in the end, an institution the empire's own administrative apparatus could rebuild after almost any disaster. Census records, standing tax revenue, warehouses stocked in advance, workshops that never stopped producing. Its danger to any individual emperor was real, but the underlying financial architecture kept functioning even through mutiny and civil war. The Janissary Corps reveals the opposite failure mode of the exact same underlying problem. A permanent cash-salaried standing army, if left to grow without a hard ceiling and without a mechanism forcing its membership back toward actual military need, doesn't simply become expensive. It becomes a self-perpetuating financial and political interest group, one that can vote with mutinies instead of ballots, and one whose own continued existence eventually outweighs its usefulness to the state that created it. The Devshirme gave the empire an army it acquired for free, 2 centuries of hereditary enrollment, assam trading, and accession bonuses handed that same army the power to decide who sat on the throne that paid its salary. By 1826, the corps that had once stormed the walls of Constantinople and terrified European armies with the sound of its own marching band had become, in the coldest possible accounting terms, a bloated pension liability with a standing army attached to it, 135,000 names on a payroll, a fraction of whom could actually fight. All of them protected by 2 centuries of accumulated political leverage that no sultan before Mahmud II had been strong enough or patient enough to confront directly. Which leaves us with a genuinely different way of understanding what actually ended the Janissary Corps, 600 years after a Balkan farm boy first walked into an Ottoman training barracks, having never chosen to be there at all. It was not a rival army on some foreign battlefield that finally beat them. It was not even really the cannons Mahmud II turned on their own barracks, decisive as that single morning was. It was 2 centuries of payslips changing hands between merchants who had never held a musket. Clueless bonuses handed out 4 times in 5 chaotic years. A tax-exempt shop economy quietly undercutting the guilds meant to fund the state. And a salary structure that made mutiny a more reliable payday than campaign season ever was. The Corps had, slowly and almost accidentally, engineered itself into something the Treasury could no longer afford to keep and no sultan could safely afford to fire, until one sultan finally decided that burning down the barracks and rewriting 600 years of military tradition from the ground up was cheaper in the end than one more accession bonus.